The Snelling Incident by Zinka Wistram. Chapter 1. It begins. The family spent nearly a week holed up in the attic of their building, doing their best to make no noise and draw no attention when the shit hit the fan, as 17-year-old Will liked to say, because he wasn't supposed to say shit, but who really cared now? They did all right, the four of them and two cats, because it was an old and withered-looking Victorian, less starchy and frilled grandmother, and more the grand old lady left in her rocking chair in a back room long after death. You could see where beauty had once been, and how the house must have been a sight back in her day. But you also might avoid getting overly close out of fear a stiff wind might hit her wrong and knock the whole place over. The abandoned look of the place seemed to keep anyone from trying to get into it. Eve Aubrey, mother of the brood, as she liked to call them, had decided pretty early, when what was at first referred to as the riots began. Their downstairs apartment was not safe, nor was traveling the streets to get someplace safe an option. Mass transit was down almost immediately, though while the radio was still broadcasting news on every channel, there were tales of heroic bus drivers or train operators getting their passengers to safety even after someone, or more than someone, started losing it on their vehicles. Chunky, out-of-shape Eve had grabbed the tornado box, handed it off to 11-year-old Katrin, had Will help his wobbly, ailing older brother up the stairs to the attic. By the time Will got back down to the main apartment from the third-floor attic, Eve had packed water, buckets, and food in the huge duffel bags that had spent them all away from pain and terror 8 years ago. Will dragged those up, and Eve grabbed blankets, and they made it upstairs, just as the sounds of the first gunshots and sirens in their neighborhood reached them. In the attic, Will and Katrin covered all four windows with blankets to hide their presence. Katrin set up lanterns in case the power went out, which it did by morning. Eve dragged a dusty old mattress out of a pile of left-behind junk from previous tenants, and pulled it into the maid's room, the place she judged to be most secure. The maid's room had a heavy wooden door and a bare, unpolished wooden floor. It had been used for nothing more than storage for nearly 100 years. Once they were safely locked into that room, there were 4 locked doors between them and the outside, all heavy Victorian solid hardwood doors locking into solid oak frames. After Katrin, Val, and the cats were safely locked in, Will and Eve ran back down, as quietly as they could, gathered a few more last-minute things, and locked all the downstairs doors. Then the downstairs door up to the attic, then the second-floor door to the attic, and the upstairs attic door. Katrin let them in, and locked the door behind them again. Val was rocking in place on the mattress, munching on a granola bar, and playing his Game Boy with his earbuds in. "Shit," Eve said, looking at her elder son as he rocked, occasionally stilling to pet the cat curled up on his lap. "His wheelchair!" "Should I?" Will started, only to be interrupted by some kind of explosion nearby. They crowded around the window, peering out into the darkening Twilt City. Several blocks away, there were flames rising from what appeared to be elementary school. "No," Eve said. "We'll reassess in the morning." Eve, Katrin, and Val slept curled up together on the grimy mattress, sharing a blanket. Will sprawled in a legless armchair that had been tipped on its side in the maid's room for decades. Eve fervently hoped there would be no spiders in it. She wasn't sure she could not scream if there were spiders. Sleep was fitful and interrupted by shouts, shots, sirens, and crashes, but no further explosions. They did all right for a week. That first morning, they managed to get downstairs and grab Val's wheelchair from the foyer while Katrin sat with Val himself. Val listened to the radio, rocking now and then, but not as often as usual. Eve wondered how much he understood, considering she'd once been told he'd never progress farther than a 5-year-old. Clearly, he understood far more than a 5-year-old would, but he rarely spoke, and it was hard to judge what he thought about all this, other than he was afraid. He flinched at noises, rocked back and forth more slowly and less than normal, and stopped speaking altogether. So she knew he was scared. She was too. The power went out the first morning in the attic. Eve and Will did what they could to hide the maid's room door behind piles of boxes and junk in the main room of the attic. They took down the blankets in case that looked more suspicious, keeping only the one covering the maid's room window. They locked themselves back in the maid's room and waited, listening to the radio as quietly as possible. There was nothing from the upstairs neighbor in the apartment right below the attic. Will said he was out of town, at a concert down south somewhere, and his cat was boarded with one of his friends. Though upstairs, as Eve called him, being terrible with names, often left his door unlocked, they'd locked his place up as they'd retreated up to the attic. With the power out, they used Katrin's lanterns for light at night. The radio ran off batteries, as did Eve's phone and Val's Game Boy. The radio lasted just fine, but Eve's phone was off by the second day, and Val's Game Boy the day after that. Will and Katrin were perfectly capable of keeping busy reading books, but Val couldn't read, so Eve began to read the Harry Dresden books out loud, one ear cocked for the sound of anyone else in the house. Todd is like Harry Dresden, Katrin said mournfully in the middle of Book 3, as she rummaged in the tornado box for another notebook, having drawn all the way through the first one. The tornado box was a very large Rubbermaid bin, with a cover in which Katrin left many supplies she felt she might need if there was a tornado. Before the tornado box, storms and high winds were a source of terror for her. Afterward, while still frightened, she was at least grimly prepared. Inside the tornado box was a disposable litter box, dry cat food, which Cassiopeia normally disdained, but begrudgingly ate after day 2, notebooks, snacks, writing supplies, comics, juice boxes, small toys for her and for Val, and a massive first aid pack ordered from a camping supply catalog. Katrin had dragged the heavy box up the stairs that first night, with Bertram tucked beneath her arm. Bertram the tiger that Todd had given her years ago, when Todd had first moved in. Eve lowered the book, Grave Peril, and looked at her daughter. Her mouth pulled back, with a sadness held in check. Harry is a lot like Todd, yes? They're both tall and sarcastic, and brave and fierce, and protective of little girls, Katrin said staunchly. Eve smiled, a little bittersweet. Yeah, that too. I miss Todd, Val said, speaking up for the first time since they entered the attic. I know you do, kiddo, Eve said. Do you think he's okay? Katrin asked. By now it was more than clear that the world outside the attic had gone mad. Whole cities had gone dark. There were no more sirens blaring in St. Paul, and no one moved on the streets. Sometimes there was still screaming, but not too near. The formerly grand old Victorian and most of the neighborhood still stood, but Eve had stopped letting the kids watch out the window because bodies lay untended in the street. The city smelled of rotten smoke, Will said. Eve had no sense of smell. I hope so, Eve said. He's strong and smart, Will said. He's probably fine. He's probably on his way here, Katrin exclaimed, clasping her hands together excitedly. I don't know, Eve started. Todd coming, Val insisted. What about the uncles? Katrin asked. They're up north in Duluth on vacation. Maybe Duluth is okay. And they stayed in the attic for days after that. Sometimes Katrin held Bertram and reassured him that Todd was coming. And Eve pursed her lips and said nothing. There was no way to know if Todd was still alive, if the uncles still lived. No way to text them, no way to email, no way to call. She'd had no news for several days, not since the cell phone had died. Eve didn't even know if the cell phone network worked anymore. They ate emergency food and drank water. Are we waiting to be rescued? Will asked one morning, looking over his last 2 granola bars. I'm not sure, Eve admitted. We probably need to decide that. We can't just run out for supplies and leave your brother and sister here. We need to stick together. Firemen coming, Val said. I can run out for supplies, Will said. Eve's heart pinched hard. Give me a bit to consider everything. This neighborhood wasn't safe before all this, and I'm not betting it's safe now. Radio says there are still actively infected people out there, roaming the streets. We could see if we can get into the radio station. We know there's an uninfected survivor there. He's already asked us not to do that. He ain't opening the door for anyone right now. In the background, Robbie Rocket's voice came over the radio station. There were long periods of silence today, and some music playing off and on. Val was of the opinion Robbie Rocket was asleep. Will worried Robbie Rocket was sick, a later active infection. Most people abandoned the cities in the riots, Will said, thinking out loud. Those who are left are not safe, Eve said. I don't know how many others there are who aren't infected, who survived the riots. I haven't seen anyone outside. Ozzy? Val asked. Haven't seen Ozzy, kiddo, Eve said. Ozzy's hiding for now. If he was smart. He was, she thought, and Ozzy, a long-haired feral black cat who roamed the neighborhood, was plenty smart. She snickered a little, and the kids looked at her, waiting for her to explain. Oh, Ozzy. Ozymandias. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. It seems just fitting all of a sudden. I don't get it, Will said. So Eve recited one of the few poems other than Jabberwocky she knew well enough to recite. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculpture well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare the lone and level sands stretch far away. Will shivered. That's Shelley, Eve said. I named Ozzy after that poem. Creepy, Mom, Katrin said. Oh, sure, coming from you. Wednesday Adams II, Eve said, with a grin. The kids grinned back, Val chuckled, and they all laughed, and it felt wonderful. Ozzy all fine, Val said stoutly, then turned his attention back to the 2 toy cars he was driving over the mattress. Chapter 2. I Viking. Eve snuck downstairs when it was dark enough to disguise her movements, but light enough to not require a flashlight. Will followed her, locking each door as she passed through, waiting for her to knock to be let back in. She grabbed soft food for the cats Cassie and Leah, toilet paper, and people food, stuffing it into some reusable grocery bag she kept hanging on the back of the front door to their apartment. Mice, or rats, scattered as she slunk around her own apartment, listening for any noise from the street. To the east, she could hear someone shouting a name, hoarsely, over and over, the inflection just off enough to mark it as the voice of one of the infected, and not someone searching for a loved one. She peeked out the windows around the house, saw several in the back of the house were broken, and her heart stopped, in fear that one of them had come inside, and she hadn't heard them moving around. Holding her breath, she scrambled as silently as she could back to the attic door, whispering and knocking for Will to let her in. He swung the door open and locked it as soon as she was through, and she stood for a moment, trying to catch her breath and slow her heart down. There's a lot of damage to the neighbor's house, she whispered to Will. Windows are broken in my room and the pantry. She nodded up the stairs, and they hurried back behind the rest of the attic doors, locking anything they could, barricading the main door of the attic itself as well. The kids ate cold canned soup from the can. Will emptied the bathroom bucket out in the main attic room, into a forgotten barrel he'd emptied of ruined clothes. Eve ate one of the last granola bars, then tucked the kids, Will included, into the mattress bed, and took Will's place in the broken chair, pulling the chair close to the window. Once the lanterns were out, she pulled the blanket back from the window just enough to watch the street. The voice yelling a name over and over came closer, faded towards the south, then came closer again. Glancing at the children, Eve saw Val was awake, his eyes gleaming in the dark, his arm wrapped as tightly around his little sister as Katrin's arm was wrapped around Bertram. She did her best reassuring smile for Val, then held her finger to her lips to remind him to be quiet. Shouter, as Eve had begun calling him in her head, came into sight up the block to the south and east, calling out a name with every breath. He was terribly thin, slumped over as he walked, his gait erratic. He didn't avoid the bodies and wreckage in the street, and stumbled frequently. In the moonlight, his eyes appeared to be bulging, his hands shaking. His voice wavered, disappeared, and returned threadily. As far as she could tell, he was yelling Linda, but didn't seem to be looking for an answer. As she watched, he sat down in the street and began tearing away handfuls of flesh from one of the bodies, one of her neighbor's bodies, and stuffed the flesh into his mouth. Revolted and horrified, she let the curtain drop for a moment, then carefully lifted to watch him again, to make sure he didn't approach the house. She didn't have any real weapons, just the stun gun, and she wasn't sure how he'd react.